Hello, my dear listeners, and welcome back to Serene Slumber Tales. Tonight, we will step softly into the world of The Witcher. Imagine yourself settling into a warm bed, the soft sound of rain pattering against your window, while a flickering candle keeps you company. Tonight's journey is not hurried. It is meant to soothe your mind, to transport you far away into a realm where magic was born from chaos, where monsters creep in the dark forests, and where extraordinary men and women known as witches walk between fear and legend. Curl up now, let your thoughts drift, and prepare to hear the origins of the continent, its magic, and the warriors forged by fire and alchemy. The story begins, as so many do in the sagas of old, with a land both wondrous and unforgiving, vast enough to cradle empires and cruel enough to swallow them whole. This land is known simply as the continent. It is a name that carries weight, not because of its poetry, but because it needs none. The continent is a character in its own right, sprawling, ancient, layered with centuries of memory. To walk its paths is to tread upon history itself, to place your feet upon soil that has drunk both the blood of heroes and the tears of widows. It is a place of contradictions, where beauty and brutality exist not as opposites, but as inseparable twins. Picture it, if you've never traveled these roads before. Forests that seem without end, their canopies so high they blot out the sun, their trunks so wide they could cradle a cottage in their shade. These are not ordinary woods. They are places where roots have burrowed for centuries, where the bark itself seems to whisper fragments of songs older than any kingdom that ever claimed dominion over them. There are mountain ranges, jagged and merciless, whose peaks stab at the sky as if in defiance of the heavens, cloaked in snow that never melts even under summer's gaze. Valleys coil between them, treacherous with hidden passes. Caves where things older than men still stir. Swamps stretch out like festering wounds, their mists clinging to skin and soul alike, thick and damp as a shroud, muffling sound and vision so that one cannot tell friend from phantom. And yet, amid all this, there is beauty so sharp it wounds, fields of wildflowers blooming in colors no tapestry could capture. Rivers so clear they reflect the stars as if the sky itself had fallen into them. The continent is no paradise, no utopia. It is a mosaic of marvels and horrors. But perhaps more than its landscapes, it is the weight of time that defines this place. The continent is not a singular story, but a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten, each civilization leaving behind traces of ink, scars of conquest, ruins of glory, and ghosts of memory. The people who walk its soil carry that history in their bones, whether they acknowledge it or not. To understand the continent is to understand that it is not one world, but many worlds layered upon each other, colliding, merging, and clashing in endless cycles. The first to leave their mark upon this land were the elder races, and of these, the elves, known in their tongue as the Aensider, stand most prominent. Theirs was no humble beginning. Legends claim they came not from distant shores or hidden valleys, but from beyond the stars themselves, arriving through veils of mystery at a time when the world was still young. They brought with them gifts that reshaped the continent, music that could still the heart of beasts, poetry so intricate that even centuries later, human scholars struggled to grasp its depth, and, most formidable of all, a mastery of magic. This was not mere parlor trickery, not sleight of hand, but a force of creation and destruction woven into the fabric of reality. To the elves, magic was as natural as breath, and they wielded it to bend forests to their will, to coax rivers into new courses, to carve cities into living rock. Do not mistake them, however, for the whimsical fair folk of bedtime tales. The Aensidae were proud, fierce, and often ruthless. They thought of themselves not as visitors, but as rightful stewards of this world, guardians appointed by destiny itself. Their beauty was sharp-edged, their wisdom tinged with arrogance. They loved the land deeply, but they loved it in the way one loves a possession. Something to be guarded, yes, but also something to be ruled. For centuries they reigned, their songs echoing through halls of marble and forests alive with enchantment. But they were not alone. Soon after came the dwarves, as different from the elves as night from day. If elves embodied elegance, dwarves embodied endurance. Born of stone and forged in the heart of mountains, dwarves were shorter in stature but unyielding in spirit. They built with hands as steady as bedrock, carving halls into the roots of mountains so deep and strong that even now, centuries of war and weather have not toppled them. Their craftsmanship was unmatched, armor that could turn aside the fiercest blade, weapons that did not dull, mechanisms that baffled even the cleverest human scholars. Where elves sang to the trees, dwarves split the rock, coaxing veins of silver and gold from the earth, hammering out treasures that could endure for generations. Alongside them, though often overlooked in grand retellings, were the gnomes. These were the inventors, the dreamers of contraptions that blurred the line between magic and technology. They were builders of devices that wheezed and clanked, clever artisans who turned scraps into wonders. If elves gave poetry and dwarves gave permanence, gnomes gave ingenuity, the spark of invention that pushed the continent's early peoples into new horizons. And then, long after the world seemed settled, came the humans. They were not born of the land, nor shaped by its ancient magics, but thrust into it by calamity. Their arrival is tied to the conjunction of the spheres, a cataclysm in which countless worlds collided, spilling creatures and forces into realms where they did not belong. Humans stumbled into the continent like refugees of the cosmos, bewildered and alien. But if they arrived last, they adapted fastest. They bred quickly, spread faster, and hungered endlessly for land, for power, for dominion. While elves sang and dwarves built, humans conquered. They carved kingdoms into the soil, planting banners like vines, their roots spreading until they choked the ground beneath them. It was not long before humans, with their sheer numbers and insatiable ambition, became the dominant race. Their rise was swift, their empires sprawling, and with their ascension came the fall of others. The elves, once rulers, found themselves hunted, their forests seized, their cities abandoned. The dwarves, too proud to bow, retreated into their mountains, their voices fading from the great councils of the land. The gnomes became curiosities, their inventions pilfered, their wisdom reduced to novelty. The continent became a human world, though haunted still by the shadows of those who came before. And here lies one of the central truths of the continent, the pulse that drives its stories and gives them weight. It is not a fairy tale, no simple fable of good triumphing over evil. It is a place of tension, of coexistence that is rarely peaceful, where grudges stretch across centuries and the wounds of the past never truly heal. The elves do not forgive the theft of their lands. The dwarves do not forget the indignities of human greed. The humans, in turn, justify their dominion as destiny, as the natural order of things. What emerges from this cauldron is not harmony, but a simmering conflict, always ready to boil over. Violence is never far, and yet so too is beauty, resilience, and the stubborn spark of hope. The continent is alive not because it is perfect, but because it is imperfect, layered, fractured, and endlessly complex. It is here that the tales of witches, kings, rebels, and monsters find their stage. And it is here, amid the clash of peoples and the weight of history, that the story truly begins. But how, you might wonder, did this fractured land, already layered with history and blood, become a place so saturated with sorcery, riddled with monsters, and scarred by chaos? The answer does not lie in the ambitions of kings or the hubris of elves. It lies in a single moment, the most defining, most catastrophic, and most mysterious event in the continent's entire history. It is remembered in whispers and chronicles alike as the conjunction of the spheres. Long ago, so long that the memory of it has become less history than myth, the continent was different. It was still vast, still dangerous, but in a quieter, more natural way. Its skies did not roar with wyverns or dragons. Its rivers flowed untroubled, free from the lurking hands of drowners and the corpses they pull beneath. Its fields grew wheat and barley, not shimmering portals to alien dimensions. In those days, one might say the world was harsh, but comprehensible, a place governed by rules that could be learned and respected. Life and death followed their steady rhythms. There were no sorcerers, no curses, no rifts in the air, humming with untapped power. It was, in short, a world without magic. And then one night, everything changed. The heavens trembled. Stars flared like dying torches. What followed was no gentle brushing of cosmic neighbors, but a shattering collision. The spheres, the countless worlds that float alongside our own, each existing in their own dimensions of time and space, suddenly converged. They did not politely knock upon each other's doors. They smashed together with the violence of storms, tearing through the fabric of reality as claws tear through cloth. The conjunction was less an event than a wound, deep, jagged, and impossible to heal. From that wound spilled chaos. Beings that had never belonged to this land were hurled into it without warning. Demons clawed their way into the night, their forms grotesque, their hunger insatiable. Spirits, once bound to distant realms, found themselves trapped here, like birds caught in a cage too small for their wings. Creatures of nightmare and wonder alike tumbled through the cracks. Vampires who had never tasted human blood until then. Ghouls that crept into cemeteries like shadows wearing flesh. Spectral riders who seemed born from fear itself. The continent, once harsh but orderly, became forever changed. Yet among all the strange beings and creatures, there was something else, something even more dangerous than fangs or claws. Into the very bones of the world seeped an energy that had no name at first, an invisible storm that twisted whatever it touched. It seeped into rivers, glimmering faintly beneath the surface. It curled into stones, humming when struck. It slipped into living flesh, most powerfully into humankind. This was chaos, raw and unbound. In time, it would come to be called magic. But magic was not a gift freely given. It was not benevolent. It was fire handed to a child, a tool that could warm or incinerate depending on how it was used. Those few who felt it stir within their blood often found it overwhelming. Some were burned to ash from within, their bodies unable to contain the torrent. Others twisted into monstrosities, their bones reshaped, their minds unspooled until nothing human remained. Still, others were driven into madness. Mad kings, raving prophets, wanderers babbling about stars and shadows. Chaos was intoxicating, yes, but it was also hungry. It demanded payment in blood and sanity. It took centuries for humanity to learn even a fraction of control. Whole generations were sacrificed in the attempt. Tribes experimented, some worshipping chaos as a god, others shunning it as a curse. Slowly, painstakingly, knowledge was gathered. The first mages were less teachers than survivors, those rare few who endured the flames of chaos without being reduced to ashes. They became figures of awe and terror, revered as prophets in one village, hunted as demons in the next. From them grew the orders and schools that would one day shape kingdoms. Over time, these scattered wielders of magic bound themselves into circles and councils, realizing that without unity, their power would tear them apart. They formed brotherhoods and conclaves, each with their own philosophies about how chaos should be used or restrained. Some sought harmony, studying endlessly, delving into grimoires and tomes to bend chaos toward healing, protection, and growth. Others saw in it the ultimate weapon, a force that could bring kings to heel and empires to ruin. Whether benevolent or cruel, one thing was certain. They were no longer mere men and women. They were sorcerers, magicians, wielders of a force that set them apart from all others. Soon, kings took notice. What ruler could resist the lure of magic at his council table? Sorcerers became advisors, their whispers carrying more weight than the clash of swords. They directed wars, subtly or overtly, bending politics to their will. Some ruled from shadows, draped in velvet and flame, their hands steering the course of nations. Others walked openly as power brokers, shaping history with a gesture. Magic, once wild and free, was now chained and harnessed, or so it seemed. But chaos could never truly be caged. Even as sorcerers rose in power, chaos remained unpredictable. It was as likely to rot a crop as it was to save it. It could knit flesh together or unravel it with equal ease. Entire cities thrived under its blessings one day and burned under its wrath the next. For every spell that healed, another corrupted. For every ward of protection, there was a curse that lingered for generations. Humanity, clever as it was, had only scratched the surface of control. Beneath their structures and councils, chaos seethed, waiting. And so, the conjunction of the spheres was not merely an accident of cosmology. It was a scar carved into reality itself, one that never healed. It did not just bring monsters. It did not just deliver spirits or demons. It rewrote the very essence of the continent, entwining chaos into the marrow of the world. From that night forward, the continent would never again know what it meant to be ordinary. This is why every tale told upon its soil is touched, in some way, by the conjunction. Every monster hunted in the dark, every sorcerer who bends the elements, every kingdom toppled by spells cast in desperation, these are echoes of that single night when worlds collided. The conjunction was not an event confined to the past. It is the eternal present of the continent, pulsing still in its rivers, forests, and skies. It is the inheritance of every creature that calls this land home, whether they embrace it, fear it, or attempt to slay it. And so, when we speak of monsters and mages, of chaos and crowns, we must always remember it all began on that night when the spheres tore open the heavens. The continent was no longer a world of men or elves or dwarves alone. It became a crossroads, a scarred battlefield of worlds, forever bound by the chaos that seeped into its veins. And so, after the chaos of the conjunction and the long shadow it cast over every valley, village, and throne, we arrive at the figures most central to our tale, the witches. To understand them is to understand the peculiar blend of human ingenuity and cruelty, of pragmatism and desperation that defines so much of the continent's history. They are symbols of mankind at its most resourceful and at its most ruthless. In the centuries after the conjunction, the world was unrecognizable. The forests that once harbored nothing more dangerous than wolves now groaned with leshens, ancient, antlered horrors that commanded roots and shadows. The rivers, once a source of life, now hid drowners and vodyanoi waiting to drag the unsuspecting into their depths. Abandoned castles crumbled beneath the weight of curses, birthing strigas and wraiths that preyed on the living. To walk alone at night was less an act of courage than a gamble with death. Humanity, which had clawed its way to dominance through sheer numbers and relentless ambition, suddenly found itself fragile again, its villages and kingdoms threatened by terrors that swords and shields could not overcome. Ordinary soldiers, no matter their bravery, stood little chance. What was steel against the incorporeal form of a wraith, or against the thick hide of a fiend with eyes that could mesmerize prey? Farmers with pitchforks fared even worse, their courage undone by claws sharper than daggers and teeth meant to tear through bone. Entire communities vanished overnight, slaughtered or driven mad. For many, life became a cycle of fear. Dawn brought only temporary reprieve, while twilight brought whispers of things moving in the dark. Humanity, faced with annihilation, did what it has always done. It adapted. But adaptation, in this case, was no gentle process. It was forged in blood and desperation. Priests offered prayers, kings raised armies, scholars studied the arcane. But it was the alchemists, the shadowy experimenters working on the edges of morality, who proposed the most radical solution. If monsters could not be killed by ordinary men, then perhaps men could be remade into something extraordinary. Thus began the experiments that would birth the witches. The subjects were not volunteers. Who would choose such a fate? Instead, the alchemists turned to those whom society had already discarded: orphans, abandoned children, the nameless and unwanted. Taken from streets, fields, and burned villages, these boys were brought to hidden fortresses where their fates were sealed. Their childhoods ended at the gates. What awaited inside was no education, but indoctrination, no gentle training, but brutal conditioning. They were beaten, starved, forced to endure winters without fire and summers without water. They were taught to wield swords heavier than their bodies could bear, to run until their lungs screamed, to fight until their hands bled. Every weakness was burned out of them, or they died in the process. But even the most merciless training was only the beginning. The true crucible was something far worse: the infamous trial of the grasses. This trial was alchemy at its most terrifying. The boys were subjected to mutagenic brews, concoctions of roots, venoms, and potions that warped their bodies from the inside out. Magic was threaded into the process, rituals performed to break down the old and knit the new. Their veins burned with fire, their bones cracked and reformed. Their eyes wept blood as their pupils split into feline slits that glowed in the dark. Of 10 boys who underwent the trial, perhaps one survived. The others perished in agony, their screams echoing through the halls until silence claimed them. Those who lived emerged forever changed. Their hair often paled, their veins turned dark, and their very presence seemed uncanny. They no longer tired as other men did. Their reflexes became preternatural, their senses sharpened beyond mortal limits. They could hear the flutter of bat wings from leagues away, smell fear in an enemy's sweat, see the world in perfect clarity even under moonless skies. Strength, speed, endurance, all were magnified. They became something not quite human and not quite monster. They became witches. Armed with their new abilities, witches also carried tools uniquely their own. 2 swords hung across their backs, one of steel to strike down men and beasts alike, and one of silver to pierce the hides of cursed creatures and the ethereal forms of spirits. They learned signs, rudimentary but potent spells, simplified fragments of the chaos that sorcerers wielded. With a gesture, they could conjure flame, raise a shield of force, or shove a foe back as if struck by an invisible hammer. Where kings sent armies to die in droves, witches went alone and emerged victorious. And so the witches' schools were born. Hidden fortresses became their homes, each one shaping its pupils according to its philosophy. The school of the wolf, perched in the frozen keep of Kaer Morhen, produced witches who valued balance, discipline, and professionalism. Among them would one day rise Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf himself, destined for songs and sagas. The School of the Cat bred witches with an emphasis on agility, speed, and some whispered, cruelty. The School of the Bear forged warriors as unyielding as mountains, men whose brute strength matched their massive weapons. Other schools, the Griffin, the Viper, the Manticore, each cultivated their own methods, creating witches with subtle but distinct approaches to the eternal war against monsters. Yet for all their skill, for all their sacrifices, witches were never embraced. To the common folk, they were necessary but terrifying, saviors cloaked in suspicion. Their cat-like eyes unsettled villagers. Their unnatural calm was mistaken for a lack of emotion. Rumors spread that witches were soulless, that their mutations had stripped them of compassion, leaving only cold killers behind. They were called mutants, freaks, cursed men who walked the thin line between humanity and monstrosity. Children threw stones at them, priests condemned them, and yet when a wyvern circled overhead or a barghest prowled the fields, the same villagers who spat at them offered coin for their services. It was a paradox that defined their lives, needed but hated, trusted with lives, but never with friendship. They lived in the margins, bound by the path fate had carved for them, walking roads that led always away from hearths and homes. Their pay was meager, their work unending, their deaths often unmarked. But in their solitude, they became legends. Every tale told of a witcher, the lone rider on a path, the pale-haired hunter in the moonlight, the swordsman who stood between a village and its doom, only deepened the mystique. Thus were witches born, not from nobility or destiny, but from desperation and cruelty, from experiments that most would call atrocities. They were forged to fight the monsters of the world, but in doing so, they became something monstrous themselves. And yet, In the endless dark of the continent, when a beast screamed in the night, it was often only a witcher who answered. What makes the world of the Witcher so hauntingly beautiful, so chillingly alive, is not only its swords and sorceries, not merely its witches and wars, but the way its monsters breathe life into old fears. The continent's horrors are not inventions spun from nothing. They are drawn, thread by thread, from our own folklore, the whispered warnings of grandmothers, the cautionary tales told around hearths, the shadows that lurk just beyond the edge of firelight. To walk through the Witcher's world is, in a sense, to step back into the dreams and nightmares of our own ancestors, to see their fears made flesh. Consider first the Leshen, or Leshy, one of the most striking creatures of the forests. In Slavic folklore, it was no mere monster, but a guardian spirit of the woods, a towering figure draped in bark and shadow, crowned with the antlers of a stag. It embodied nature itself, beautiful, untamed, and unforgiving. In the Witcher's world, however, the Leshen is no kindly protector. It is a terror that haunts villagers too bold, too greedy, too careless with the trees they fell and the animals they slaughter. Its power is not brute strength alone, but command. It can summon wolves as allies, roots as weapons, the forest itself as a prison. To face a Leshen is not simply to fight the beast, but to fight the will of the wild made hostile. Steel alone cannot defeat it. One must be cunning, patient, and respectful, for to underestimate a Leshen is to vanish into the forest, never to return. If the Leshen represents the wrath of nature, then the Striga represents the cruelty of men. Of all monsters, it is perhaps one of the most tragic. A Striga is not born of claws or scales, but of curses, often cast in bitterness, spite, or revenge. In many tales, a Striga is the child of noble blood, sometimes even a princess, transformed into a ravenous, night-stalking creature that feeds without reason or remorse. To look upon one is to see the corruption of innocence, the warping of something pure into horror. And yet, behind the fangs and claws lies a human heart, buried but not extinguished. Witches who face a Striga know they confront not just a monster, but a story, a tale of betrayal, jealousy, or cruelty that created it. To lift such a curse requires courage, but also compassion. For not all monsters are enemies. Some are victims of human failings, proof that mankind itself is capable of birthing horrors worse than nature ever could. From tragedy, we move to something far darker, the crones of Crookback Bog. These three figures, with their grotesque appearances and mocking laughter, seem to have stepped directly out of the darkest pages of a fairy tale. Their names, brewers, weavers, whispers, echo the rhythm of old stories meant to frighten children into obedience. They are ancient and cunning, with a humor as twisted as their forms. They strike bargains with the desperate, offering solutions wrapped in honeyed words, only to twist those wishes into nightmares. The crones embody the danger of shortcuts, the peril of asking powers beyond comprehension to solve human problems. They are not simply monsters to be slain. They are tests of morality, mirrors of human greed and desperation. They remind us that in the Witcher's world, the most dangerous stories are the ones that promise hope at a price. Then there are the vampires, and here the Witcher's world diverges from our modern imaginings. Forget the pale aristocrats draped in velvet, sipping blood from crystal goblets. These are predators, ancient and terrifying, creatures like the Bruxa or the higher vampires. They can wear beauty like a mask, their voices melodic, their faces alluring. But beneath the surface lies hunger, insatiable, relentless, primal. A bruxa, for instance, can scream with such force it shatters bones, all while moving with the grace of a dancer. They embody temptation itself, the warning that what appears beautiful may conceal death. They are the embodiment of the old truth whispered through generations, that not all that enchants should be trusted. Of course, the witch's bestiary is vast and varied. There are drowners, the grotesque remnants of drowned men haunting riverbanks and swamps, dragging the living beneath the water as if jealous of their breath. There are foglets, creatures of mist and deceit, leading travelers astray with phantom lights until they stumble into death. There are kikimoras, insectoid nightmares that rise from marshes with too many limbs and a hunger for flesh. Each is drawn from fragments of real-world myth and superstition, shaped into something more tangible, more terrifying. But what unites them all is the way they carry pieces of human fear within their forms. Each monster reflects something fundamental about humanity's anxieties. The Leshen speaks to our fear of the wild, the knowledge that forests, for all their beauty, are dangerous and indifferent to human survival. The Striga reflects our guilt and cruelty, the knowledge that we can twist innocence into monstrosity through envy and betrayal. The crones represent our dread of false hope, the bargains we know we should not make but are tempted into anyway. Vampires embody temptation and the peril of desire unchecked. Even the drowners whisper of our oldest fear, the water that both sustains and swallows. This is why the monsters of The Witcher feel so alive, so deeply unsettling. They are not alien invaders, not creatures entirely detached from human experience. They are, instead, extensions of us, our fears, our failings, our stories. They are folklore made flesh. To face them is to confront not only danger, but meaning. And this is where witches themselves come into their true role. They are not just monster hunters. They are interpreters of stories, mediators between man and myth. When a witcher slays a beast, he is not merely protecting a village. He is reaffirming humanity's place in a world that constantly threatens to overwhelm it. When Geralt confronts a Striga, he is not just swinging a sword. He is wrestling with a curse born of human sin. When he faces the crones, he is walking into the heart of the fairy tale, where choices matter as much as blades. Each contract taken by a witcher is not simply a job. It is an encounter with the essence of what humans fear most. And in facing those fears, witches reveal the uncomfortable truth. Monsters are not always the other. Sometimes they are us. This is what makes the witcher's world resonate so strongly. It is a place where folklore is not confined to fireside stories, but where those stories walk, hunt, and kill. It is a world that reminds us that legends exist for a reason, that every tale of the Leshen, the Striga, the crones, and the vampire carries a lesson about ourselves. To dismiss them as superstition is folly. To confront them is wisdom. And to survive them requires courage, steel, and perhaps a touch of silver. As the rain continues to fall softly around us, let us end tonight's journey with a story from the collection known as The Last Wish. In it, Geralt encounters a Striga, a cursed princess transformed into a beast. The tale is one of both horror and redemption. Imagine the ruined castle where the Striga prowls, its walls cracked and swallowed by vines. Moonlight filters through the broken roof as Geralt prepares for the long night ahead. He does not aim to kill, but to lift the curse that binds the girl. Armed with patience and courage, he battles not only the beast, but the curse's will itself. When dawn comes, the beast collapses, and from its twisted form emerges a girl, frail, frightened, but human once more. It is a reminder, dear listener, that even in a world filled with monsters, there is space for hope, healing, and humanity. And so, my dear adventurers, our journey through the origins of witches, magic, and the haunted world of the continent comes to an end. You have walked among elves and dwarves, witnessed the violent birth of magic, and stood beside witches as they faced creatures born of nightmare. Remember, this world is both brutal and beautiful, a mirror of our own fears and dreams. As you drift into slumber with the sound of rain wrapping you in calm, may your dreams be free of monsters and filled instead with wonder. Until our next tale, sleep well, and may the White Wolf guard your rest.